Well, let's get started. So before I talk about the actual research, I'll give you a little background and a little overview of the trip itself. Studied abroad in Kenya from January to May 2022. There really was no particular reason that I decided to apply to Kenya itself. I was fueled by a drive for exploration to go somewhere I hadn't been before. However, there was one reason which perhaps some of my fellow students can relate to. I wanted to study abroad during the winter term. Thus far, it hadn't been such a great term, freshman and sophomore year. So why not study abroad then and come back for the good terms? Ultimately, though, I didn't expect to pursue my passion for history or indulge in historical research. So about the program itself, after a 14-hour flight, we arrived. After a 14-hour flight, we arrived in Nairobi and quickly got to know. We arrived in Nairobi and quickly we started to get to know each other. It was me and 23 other St. Lawrence students. So of course, this initially proved difficult to connect. We didn't have that previous shared experience together, but after a month or so, we developed some really close connections, and I'm really happy about that. We settled into our compound. This, while it started off feeling like a strange place in a faraway land, it quickly became home to us. We had meals made for us. We had plenty of places to relax and get to know each other and just chill in general. While it started as a strange place, it became home because every other week during the program, we're traveling. So one week we would be on the compound, the other week we would be traveling. And the first travels we actually did were to Kericho, which is known for tea fields. And there are some lasting colonial legacies in Kericho based on tea cultivation. So we studied the effects of that. And we did a rural homestay. So here, that's my host mother, Rachel. I'm milking her cow. And the rural homestay was great because it showed us like agricultural lifestyle. But we also, of course, the purpose of this trip as well is for us to get to know each other. So here, we're about to go to church, all 24 of us, and meet our host families. Next, after a week back on the compound, we would spend a week on safari in Nakuru. Never been on a safari before. It was an incredible experience. Saw many flamingos because the safari is based on a lake. So many giraffes, zebras, of course. It was an incredible experience and one that is really lasting for me. However, we were not just tourists. We also did ecological studies in Nakuru. So we studied the effects of a geothermal power plant on the surrounding environment. In this case, the program itself stressed hearing both sides of an issue. So we heard about why, from a power plant representative, why the plant was good for the economy of the area of Nakuru. But then we also heard from Simon Thomaset. He runs a raptor rehabilitation facility. There's one raptor, for example, which has been injured by shoddy construction and downed power lines that come from the geothermal plant. So obviously he is not in favor of the plants and the environmental damage that it can cause. So, but it showed us what the program was all about, how we were going to think deeper about cultural issues, about environmental issues, about socioeconomic issues, and how we were going to gain a deeper perspective of that. So upon return from Nakuru, we really delved into classes. The core course, as I discussed, it encompasses the trips focusing on the cultural issues, environmental issues, development in Kenya. I took a socioeconomic developments in Kenya course. I took history of modern Kenya. There's my history professor. As you can see, he likes to put a lot of words on his slides. Nonetheless, this history course, it gave me a lot of background, which I could then use when I did the actual research. And then, of course, we took introductory Swahili, a bit of Swahili. The next in the program was my favorite component, a three-week urban homestay. Got to know my host parents and got to know my host siblings as well. Got to experience what their life was like. Got to go out and experience downtown Nairobi with them. A lot more independence than we previously experienced on the program. But then it was a bit like high school in a way, because we would all carpool to the UKC, United Kenya Club, where we would take classes. We would resume these classes that we had started on the compound. So it was my favorite part of the program. And next we went on another safari in Amboseli. This, I was blown away by the first, but this was even more spectacular. Saw plenty of elephants, hyenas, lions, elephants crossing right in front of you, lions 10 feet away from your car. It was a spectacular experience. Just can't really put it into words. And we also did a study of the Maasai. So just a little poll. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Maasai before. Yes. They are perhaps the most famous tribe to even if you haven't know about Kenya, if you don't know much about Kenya itself, chances are you've heard of the Maasai, because they're the wild, untamed tribe. So we did a study with them where we looked at how their culture has been forced to change as a result of land policies and climate change. So where they used to live in group ranches, no one owned land per se, it was owned by the village itself. They've been forced to subdivide their land into individual ownership recently. And that is because their lifestyle as nomadic pastoralists, it's no longer sustainable due to climate change and due to the presence of an enormous national park right next to their land, in Amboseli at least. And there are many effects of the presence of the national park. One in particular, if you let your livestock graze on national park land, you receive a hefty fine. But at the same time, animals that are part of the national park routinely will leave the boundaries of the park and are capable of destroying a season's worth of crops in 30 minutes. So obviously this would be devastating to you as a farmer. And then another thing, if you kill an animal that's part of the national park, then you go to jail with a big sentence. But if you yourself are killed by an animal, then it's hard pressed for your family to actually receive any compensation. So the impact of the national park and the catering to tourists that it's did over the actual residents was certainly a big focus. And next, this would be our final group excursion, the 24 of us all together. We went to Mombasa for a bit of cultural and political exploration. We visited Fort Jesus, an old Portuguese fort in the 16th century. And we also studied how Mombasa is a cultural melting pot. There is a high presence of Swahilis, which are mixed African, Arab descent people. There's a high Muslim population in comparison to the predominance of Christianity in the rest of Kenya. So how these cultures interact with each other was something we really focused on. And finally, I would return to Mombasa for a 1-month human rights internship. This was great. It really showed me the political workings of Mombasa itself, and the sort of at a grassroots level, we could understand the issues that people face in their daily lives. So here, for example, we We observed a local election, and you could see how involved people were in the polling process. This guy, he's reading, he's taking each ballot, he's reading it, and he's counting it. And at the conclusion, when he would read any ballot, there would be people watching from outside the room. And if their candidate was read, everyone would cheer for every single vote. So to show the level of interactivity that people have with the election process was really great to see. And I worked in the office as well. The most common issue we dealt with was wage theft. So people would get stiffed by their employers because they couldn't get a contract because there's such high unemployment rate. And we call the employers and try to get them to make things right. And then I also did a protest about high cost of living. So it was really a very growing experience, and I learned a lot as a result of it. And that would lead me to the actual research, where for an extra week, I stayed with my urban host parents, who I liked so much. They were very kind to host me again. And I visited the National Museums of Kenya. I visited Andy Company Museum. I visited several statues. I visited the Karen Blixen Museum, and I did interviews with prominent history professors. So there were two focuses of my historical research: comparing the colonial and independent governments, and also then, once we had established that comparison, looking at how both governments attempt to construct a sense of nationhood. As my freshman classics professor, Mark Tover, said, you're doing a talk, keep it short, try to make a point, and so you can evaluate how well I'm able to do that. So let's get started. What I'm going to do is give a little timeline from when the British arrived in Kenya to modern day. So essentially, it was the Berlin Conference of 1885, which some of you may have heard about, was where a conference between the major European imperial powers, where Africa was subdivided as if it was just a land for the taking and nothing more. And that started the scramble for Africa. The British were given Kenya at this conference, and they established a presence there, and they officially formed the British East Africa Protectorate in 1895. They established Nairobi as the capital of Kenya. That capital was segregated. They imposed hut and poll taxes, and they had loyalist chiefs of various villages impose their colonial policy and collect these taxes. And the one policy which showed the extent of the authority that they had arbitrarily imposed and unjustly opposed was the Kipande system, which was it was a necklace and box that any African working in a city would wear, and the European had any European was given magisterial powers over any African, so they could come along, ask for the box, which contained the identification of the Africans, and if that particular individual, that European, just felt like it, for whatever reason, they had the power to sentence any African to death. So it really shows you the injustice and the extent of the powers that the British created for themselves. So another big part of the British had established authority over the people of Kenya. And now they also had established authority over all the lands. Upon arrival, they declared that all land was property of the governments. And then they began to lease this land and sell this land to British colonial settlers who would come. They would receive 999-year leases at a price of 2 pence per acre. So it really is ridiculous. It's like not even fathomable to receive a 999-year lease. And the people who were the Africans who were evicted from their land, they had no choice but to become squatters on their own previously owned land. An infamous example of this is of the massacre we talked about. They were forcibly removed from Ngong Hills just outside Nairobi because the colonial government wanted this land. They were moved a few hundred miles west to Laikipia. But then a few months later, once they were all settled in their new land, the British decided that the land in Laikipia was actually superior to the lands in Ngong. So no matter, they evicted them again and moved them back to so it's really another example for you right there. Now, the British had declared authority over all the people in all the land, but how would they enforce that authority? What would they use to persuade Africans that they should actually support this government and that it was something that was worth supporting, and that that if they supported it, they could actually gain from supporting it? Well, they would do this by a process of constructing nationhood. So in order to show off the power and influence of the British Empire, they would construct statues such as this Queen Victoria statue constructed in 1906. They would name streets after famous British monarchs. So Victoria Street, King's Road, Queen's Road. They constructed lavish government buildings such as the State House, painted all white and it was on prominent display in downtown Nairobi. And they would have celebrations of colonial power. These celebrations actually also doubled as a way to convince other British to settle in Kenya. Lord Delamere was perhaps the most infamous settler. He owned over 40,000 acres of land in Naivasha, and he was really the leader of the colonial settlers. He had a Happy Valley set in which some of the behaviors that he and his fellow colonialists partook in included rampant drug use and wife swapping, for example. He really represented to the colonial settlers what your life could be like, how freely you could live if you came to Kenya. And so the colonial government installed him as the father of the nation. And a statue was constructed of him, a street was named after him. And he served as a selling point for other other Europeans to come to Kenya. Now, this colonial power was all well and good for the British. It lasted for a good 30 years. However, World War II proved to be a watershed event that would weaken colonial power, both from the outside and the inside. The British were faced after World War II with internal pressure from the in the form of the Mau Mau Revolution. World War II veterans, African veterans, who fought in Europe during the war, they realized they had busted the narrative of white supremacy that the British had used to enforce their power. And they also gained new skills that showed to them that they were capable of self-governance and that they didn't have to accept colonial rule anymore. And thus, many of them helped form the Mau Mau Land and Freedom Army, which fought against the King's African Rifles, which was the British faction, mainly composed of loyalist Africans. And of course, when there were hundreds of thousands of Africans fighting each other and only a few thousand British colonialists present, over 10,000 Africans were killed on both sides and only 2,000 Europeans were killed. Nonetheless, the 8-year state of emergency that the Mau Mau Revolution caused was a big pressure on the British government, and it showed them. It was the first sign of weakness, first major sign of revolution within Kenya. At the same time, emerging African nationalists, those many of whom had been educated in Britain and also had the war experience. They knew they were capable of self-governance, and they're willing to fight for that in conversation with British. Jomo Kenyatta would emerge as the leader of the Kapingura Six. They are prominent nationalists in Kenya. And eventually the British, faced with this pressure, they allowed 6 Kenyans into the legislature. But the achievement of rights just strengthened the Africans' drive for independence. They saw they were gaining victories, and they now would not stop until they achieved independence. At the same time, the British faced this internal pressure, but they also faced external pressure from the United Nations. Upon the conclusion of the war, the United Nations was established in 1945, and the idealism of the newly formed United Nations was completely contrary to what colonialism stood for. The UN Charter, signed in San Francisco and signed by 4 African nations, talked about human rights, about vindication. That really spoke directly to those in Kenya who wanted independence, and at the same time put pressure on the British to give Kenyans independence. And so in the mid-50s, the British realized that independence was inevitable, and then that they should try to plan for it so it could happen on their terms. Thus, they hosted the Lancaster conferences, 3 conferences in the early 60s in London, in which the prominent African nationalists met with the colonial secretary and other colonial officials to discuss the terms for self-governance and independence and draft a constitution, a preliminary constitution. Critically, however, the Mau Mau, whom had done so much fighting for independence, were not represented at the conferences, which would have major repercussions down the line and would be the start of something there. Independence itself occurred on December 12, 1963. Jomo Kenyatta, leader of KANU, Kenyan African National Union, became the first president. He really had enormous power of persuasion. He was capable of unifying Africans across tribal lines when tribalism was an issue. And he knew how to work with former colonial officials. And this, as we will see, would prove to be a big factor, as those who gained power in the independent government often had strong British ties or had worked with the British previously and had been educated in Britain. And one person in particular was Jomo Kenyatta's close ally, the Attorney General, Charles Njonjo. As you can see from his very fancy Savile Row suit, he catered to British interests very often. He was so British, he was referred to as the Duke of Cambridgeshire. And he protected the upper class interests, mainly those of which were the interests now of the ex-colonialists, who were allowed to keep their land, which critically we will talk about soon. Now, some individuals also kept power in the independence governments. Jomo Kenyatta realized that it was somewhat in his interests to keep rapport with the British, in his own economic interests, to keep a rapport with the British. And thus, even though independence had been attained, British influence was still very present. An example is a border. On the border between Tanzania and Kenya, upon independence, many Tanzanians tried to cross the border to visit their neighbors just above the border. They were members of the same tribe. And they considered the border to be arbitrary. They always had, and they thought that with the attainment of independence, that they would be allowed to cross as they saw fit. However, this was not the case. The British Army was called in to enforce the border. And so that would show the direction of the independence government. Statues of Kenyatta were constructed in Britain, and as we mentioned, settlers might retain their land. There was still colonial influence within the post-independence government as well. The former Minister of Agriculture, Bruce Mackenzie, was a colonial leftover. So he had held the same position in the colonial governments, and now he would work closely with Charles and Jomo to mainly protect the interests of British who still lived there, who still lived in Kenya. The policy of Jomo Kenyatta's land policy would prove to be one of the most infamous policies in Kenyan history, one which still has repercussions today and is still a hot topic today. In adopting a policy of forgive and forget towards former colonialists, Kenyatta declared that that the former colonialists would be allowed to keep all their lands, and that people who had their land taken would not have any land redistributed to them. This, of course, meant that many were left landless, despite the fact that many of them had fought for independence. In particular, the Mau Mau, we mentioned them. Many of them had their land seized during the independence conflicts, but now they received no compensation for their role in independence, even though it had been a significant role. So the policy of willing buyer, willing seller continues to be infamous to this day. And also, the government would become more autocratic as time went on. Kenyan African National Union would ban opposition parties soon after formation, and Kenya would become a de facto one-party state just 6 years after independence, which meant Kenyatta and all ministers within KANU could run for re-election unopposed. And despite the fact that Kenyatta had been one to promote unity upon the attainment of independence, tribalism and favoritism began to seep into government policy. Thus, what we're seeing right now is really a transition from racially-based divisions, where the British are in charge, and set the policy, to class-based divisions, where mainly those who had worked with the British are in charge and are now the upper class and decide policy for themselves. So this transition is very interesting, to say the least. Now, let us also discuss the some building blocks of nationhood that the post-independence government would apply in a similar fashion to the colonial governments. The first step, of course, was to remove colonial statues. Here we have the removal of the King George statue. The Queen Victoria statue remained only because it was often mistaken for not a symbol of imperialism and British power, but for the Virgin Mary. And the construction of new building blocks of nationhood for the post-independence government began. Thus, the new father of the nation, Lord Delamere, was replaced with Jomo Kenyatta. So to speak, the colonial governments had established this precedent for establishing power, and the post-independence government decided just to take that and copy it in many regards. Thus, Jomo Kenyatta was, his statue replaced Lord Delamere's, and Delamere Avenue was renamed to Kenyatta Avenue. King's Road was renamed to Independence Road, so on and so forth. And the post-independence government also would construct many other monuments showing the power of the government and showing why you should be loyal to the government. Power, in this case, was portrayed through the Nyayo monuments, meaning footsteps, showing that you can benefit from the power, that you can be a part of the power the government is exuding if you follow in the footsteps of the government. The cockerel represents the leadership of the government, and the spear on top of Mount Kenya, which I wanted to hike, but alas, next time, represents the power of the post-independence government. So statues also promoted the peace and promoted peace towards the government and unity among Kenyans, and why you should be loyal to government. The Uhuru Gardens monuments, Uhuru, by the way, means freedom, and is also the name of the son of Jomo Kenyatta, Uhuru Kenyatta, who was president from 2013 to 2022. Just in August, actually, we had the general election. Nonetheless, this monument promotes peace, freedom, unity. The dove represents peace, and the raising of the flag represents the unity of the Kenyan people. But let us take a closer look at this monument. Does this piece of the monument look familiar to anybody? That is exactly right. We see that we see where the inspiration of this monument came from. And what does this tell us? It really shows us that it's indicative of a shallow understanding of what this nation actually stands for. The post-independence government understands that these monuments will promote support for the government, but they don't really know exactly what message they want their government to stand for, what they want the government to stand for, what they want to say. So if it's possible to copy famous monuments that stand for patriotism and loyalty towards the state and still attain the same thing, they'll take it at this point. So let's talk about Kenya today. A new constitution was signed into law in 2010 by President Mwai Kibaki, attempting to address injustice, inequality, women's representation in government, and several old remaining colonial policies were eradicated. There's a switch from the Westminsterian system to a bicameral system, finally, after 50 years. But as you can see, some British standards still remain, such as judges wearing wigs. It's interesting to say the least. And there's also a lot of globalization and development going on in Kenya. The Two Rivers Mall, which I went to, is an enormous mall, 8 stories, 200 stores, go-karting track as well, which I went to. It was good. And but it's placed right next to informal settlements where people, they're unable to receive clean water, food, quality education at all, very overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. So these this development is right next to very people who are in need of the development the most and are in dire straits. So it shows that the divisions in society are still very present. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's enormous development project in Kenya, is seeking to construct expressways, bridges, and tunnels all over Kenya. However, these projects are controversial because the Chinese import all their own labor and engineers. So the Kenyan laborers do not benefit much from this. And actually, this was my ride to the airport, Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. As you can see, it's an extremely fancy, extremely nice road, just completed on the last day of my trip. But the tolls are extremely expensive, so not everyone can actually afford to use these new developments. They really pander to the rich. They give privilege to the rich. And because these developments are so expensive, there's questions of whether it's creating a debt trap for Kenya, which could lead to some neo-colonial policies. Ultimately, the wealth gap remains large, and power and land are a hereditary affair. As we mentioned, there's Jomo Kenyatta, first president, Uhuru Kenyatta, his son, president from 2013 to 2022, and Muhoho Kenyatta, his other son, who runs the business enterprise of the Kenyatta family. And they own hundreds of thousands of acres. They're big in agriculture, media. They have their own news company, food. They have a ton of industry, a ton of influence. And also, thanks to, as we discussed, willing buyer, willing seller, Lord Delmar's grandchildren still own his 42,000 acres and can use it as they see fit. And it's efforts to ascertain who originally owned that land have been few and far between. Ultimately, I would say this trip was incredible, and I would say what I learned from doing my research is to seek both sides of any issue, draw your own conclusions. Don't just read a government plaque at a monument and believe it, but don't disregard it either. Read that plaque, what it says, and then talk to somebody to see what they think about it and how it's personally affected their lives and how their lives have changed from independence since independence, whether for better or worse. Take into account many factors and build your own perspective. That's why I would say the homestay that I did was the best part of my experience, because I could talk to my homestay parents about my father, for example. His father was a Mau Mau fighter, and how does that affect his perspective of the independence government if the Mau Mau received no compensation for their role in independence? To hear his perspective on it was very interesting. Ultimately, despite what I've said here, Kenya, a beautiful country, a bright future, and I highly recommend everyone to visit and create your own perspective on the issues I've talked about. So thank you very much. And if there are any questions,
a wonderful presentation. I mean, clearly you could be a professor of history
Absolutely.
at any fine university. Probably one of the best presentations given either by a student or a faculty at uni, I suspect.
thank you so much.
And I wanted to ask you a question. I mean, given what you know about the history and given kind of the situations which are complex with the Mau Mau and some resentment, the differences in socioeconomics between different groups, and the Chinese factor, how would you see kind of government moving forward there in the best way for, I guess, the country and the people to make it really that bright future and that stable situation?
Well, they'll definitely have to be more inclusive of they're trying right now to create a middle class and to include everybody in this development. And that actually is what the newly elected president, William Ruto, he ran off a grassroots campaign. He talked about hustler nation. So all those young entrepreneurs who are trying to move their way up in the world, he's going to help them achieve that goal. However, it remains to be seen. There's a lot of corruption in the government, so it remains to be seen if these ideas and ambitions will actually have an effect. But yeah, I'd say that breaking down these class boundaries we talked about is definitely the first step.
Yeah.
I'm reading a book right now called Imperial Reckoning by Carolyn Elkins. I don't know if you read that, but it talks a lot about how the British conducted the way they put down the Mau Mau rebellion. Very, very interesting, talking about their treatment of Kenyans there. And it seems like, a lot of that colonial ethos managed to survive the transition to independence. and it's very much a part of sort of the government and the culture still. How much of an obstacle would you say that is to forging a nation within the independent country?
I would say, yeah, it's definitely an obstacle, for sure. Like we talked about Jomo Kenyatta, he sort of made the decision to like, partner with the British because he realized the economic gains that could be realized from that. But at the same time, it's very important to like recognize the complete injustices and malfeasances that the British and atrocities that the British committed. And some of those are being recognized now. And Mau veterans, I think there was a case a couple of years ago where a group of Mau veterans received compensation, and there was the unearthing of a massive collection of files that had been removed from Kenya by the British, which detailed like some of the torturous acts they would commit against Mau fighters that they captured. Continuing this process, and I think even like increasing the amount of compensation they give, because they only received a few $1,000s 50 years later each. That continuing to look into this is definitely critical.
Yeah.
But you took Swahili 101. What do you remember from it? Questions. How do you say thank you?
A little bit. We learned mitigation. We learned numbers. We learned which is like 1 through 5. What else did we learn? Conjugations. Ciao. Indesha Basi Haraka Kwe Sababu Tune Chalelo. That means drive the bus faster because we're getting late. So yeah, it's important to keep doing it. And I have someone I can practice with. I haven't really done much of that, unfortunately. It's important. Language learning is important.
I had a question. I mean, given what you said about them trying to encourage a middle class and entrepreneurial class, particularly amongst the younger generation, is there room for a nonprofit or something to support the Mau to really build these kinds of businesses and take advantage of becoming more middle class and therefore have greater economic power and by the same time political empowerment as well? Is that some strategy that could be employed?
Absolutely. And I don't really know how the NGOs and like support organizations work. We actually worked with like one organization, Shofco is what it's called, and they provide support to informal settlements. They like build schools there and build like housing within these informal settlements and provide water. And that was it was founded by like a prominent New York author and received a lot of foreign aid. So there's definitely projects like this. I'm not sure about anyone for the Mau, but
yeah,
trying to do some more research.
but particularly in microfinance and those kinds of areas, could encourage, and once you have the economic drivers there for better equality, then that tends to move things forward in a more positive direction.
Yeah, you say micro, and that's it's definitely important as well, because like so much of this is has to be so much like information has to be gathered through like interviews and through primary sources, because of course there's very few like historical documents. The British have like taken the important ones for the most part. And so while we're only like still a generation out from independence, it's definitely important to talk to as many of those who had experience with independence as possible. It's actually a good story, actually, is that one of the history professors I interviewed, he was present at the independence ceremony on December 12th, 1963. And he was a marshal ushering people, showing them where to sit. And one thing that happened actually was when the British flag was to be lowered and the Kenyan flag was to be raised at midnight on December 12th, 1963, the British shut off all the lights in the stadium, lowered their flag in darkness, and then raised the Kenyan flag, turned on the lights to raise the Kenyan flag. So that's a fun little story.
Another question, not that it's monopolizing, but how would you apply your knowledge of Kenyan history and this whole experience to your life here in the US and what's going on in the US? If it can be, is there translatability and so?
I think for sure, like, you know, I'm sort of interested in like, you know, white saviorism, like principle as well. And like how there's some organizations for which like, you know, they perpetrate this like image of white saviorism. And like, it was a focus of the program as well. Like, how can we avoid that? So, you know, as to how we can actually apply what's happened here to the US, I definitely want to do some more thinking about that. I'm going to write my thesis on JFK's involvement in African nations attaining independence. But I think there's many like principles to how I can take what I've learned about the specific history and like one-on-one interviews I did. There's many applications. I just have to find the specific one. But it's definitely a good thing.
I'll ask one more question, sorry. You talked about climate change, the impacts of climate change. So, you know, what we're seeing increasingly is like the total desertification of East Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea. It's really bad there. And you've seen a lot of refugees coming out of there just starving. It doesn't feel like it's reached that level in Kenya, Tanzania, that area. But did you see the effects of climate change when you were there? What are people doing about it?
Not in so many words. You know, Kenya is on the equator, of course, so they have a little more, but it is still very arid. I wouldn't say we focused so much on climate change as we did like, you know, the like sort of environmental factors that were happening in Kenya, such as the geothermal plants or like the impact of the national park on the surrounding area. The issue of climate change is definitely big though. We saw, you know, we just saw areas like we saw like very skinny cows. We saw like, you know, within the informal settlements, like very little grass growing whatsoever. Like, so although we didn't focus on it specifically, we more focused on like the views that could cause climate change or the like factors that were causing increased climate change. We didn't really talk about it.
First, I just want to say congratulations. Like your emotional and intellectual commitment to this is astounding. Very easy question, I think. Will you stay in touch with your host staff?
Yes, I hope
Will you
so.
go back?
Yeah, I told them 5 to 20 years. Guaranteed in that time. And but you know they visit. I didn't know there's a lot of Kenyans in like Seattle, so they go to Seattle quite a bit. So they might come to the East Coast as well. They do like in just a month. Yes, that's it.
What do you think, like in your opinion, the state and like the future of like grassroots like protests and organizations, like you mentioned, like you worked with like as an intern for like wage theft, and you were at a protest for I think housing, you said. I just want to know like what are people protesting about and how effective or ineffective are they being, and what, like why?
It's mainly like government corruption, like police injustice. Like it's a big issue, like police brutality and police corruption, like, and you know, really bribing the police is everyday activity. So like and like really police investigating crime. It's like if what we did was like this pregnant mother was assaulted and the police like weren't investigating the crime, so we went to raise awareness of the issue. I would say like the activities like this are really critical because this organization, while they have so many cases, if they can garner enough attention via protest or via like international attention or via appeals to the government, then they can see some change. And even if the government is corrupt, they still have to deal with, they still have incentive to keep the people like happy. So it's very necessary. Yeah.
Just like to follow up, I guess, like, so like in the public sphere, like, there's like almost a consensus that there is like issues with like the corruption that you mentioned. And the government is taking note, but are they enacting change or listening really?
There's an anti-corruption department, but then of course the anti-corruption department
Is the government, you know?
they don't investigate themselves. They do like, they'll like, for example, one case like that is like government vehicles that will just like speed through the streets, drive down the wrong side of the street when there's an incredible amount of congestion. Because there's no public transit, it's all privately owned. What the government will do, they'll investigate the driver and then they might fine the driver of the car. But then of course, like, it's just them collecting more money for themselves anyway. So like, you know, there's a number of things to work on. Thank you. All right, well, yeah, thank you so much. A great job. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you enjoyed.
I'm glad I got them.
Thank you.
Yeah, football game is already going on.
Yeah.
A bunch of pictures of that, but I can share a little bit of it.
You put me on the. Absolutely. Good job. Very, very good job.
Very,
Yeah, right.
yeah.
I mean,
Getting the roof,
Yeah.
so I need it happen. Yeah, the time move, I think, was.
oh, what time was it originally?
It was one.
Oh, yeah, really against the football game.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, we can still. What's that?
I said your question.
Yes, I watched it as part of.
Oh, thank you. No, I think you did a great job.
Oh,
Jeff, the study is amazing. I mean, how,
I really.
I hope
learned a
my
lot.
son can do something too. I mean, you know, we all, yeah, this is what we should be spending our time
Oh
doing.
my God, I could do this all day long.
Right, right.
Love to hear.
Some of it is.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Well, I hope,
Spaniard,
yeah, no, that's what I think it's all about.
Yeah.
Amazing.
They were in the coffee.
Very, very good. Yeah.
And
Yep.
even though it was fiction.
all right.
like, I'm
Good.
like-
Congratulations. Yeah.
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
Well done. You're-
Enjoyed it.
That's all.
All right, thank you so much. And you're part of then.
Administrative assistant for political science and history.
Oh, wow.
So he came in and he went to this person and that person, and the other person, he had, and I was like,
Well, sometimes it's
I'm
just
like,
finding the right person.
exactly. And honestly, I didn't really have the power to do it, but I figured out how to figure out how to do that. So I was like, even, I don't know, but I think if we have a student that wants to do this, we're gonna do what we can. to make it happen.
Yeah, well,
So-
that's exactly the right way.
And that's what I did, and I really didn't know, and then we had to move the time, and I had to get him access to get in here so that he could practice for the
I mean,
week.
this is what it's about. I mean,
All of them.
Come here. and they have great experience and they want to share it with everybody. And nobody left them.
And, you know, this is much more impressive than the president speaking. Or the, you know.
And the funny thing is I don't really know Aiden very well.
Yeah.
I talked to him last year when
Yeah.
he was in Kenya because I needed him to do stuff for his thesis for this year. And we were back and forth. I just met him this year. But yeah, and I didn't know a whole lot about him. I was like, hopefully this will go well. Really, I'm very
Yeah.
glad that like it.
No, and he should really consider being professor. I don't know what he wants to do.
Absolutely. Well, like I said, I took some pictures. I'll share.
There's a lot of
He's
things
got all
he
this.
could do.
Yeah, and we'll promote him a little bit more on the whole website.
Oh, you should.
Yeah.
Because it's a shame that more people.
Yeah.
I know it's fun to tailgate too. which will be a little bit of
Exactly,
now, but, you know,
exactly. We gotta get out to
the
that game
academic
too,
is
but it was.
integrate everything and.
Yeah, it was just, good that it all came together. And you could tell, and he was so enthusiastic about it. I'm like, I don't know quite how we'll get into the home. But let's just-
Really good.
Yeah. it's just excited that it's- No, so I was like, I don't know.
I saw him at the internet.
So Lori and I went with Lori and we walked.
Oh, great.
Well, he's trying to have a son, and so he's grown and
Here.
I know. Yeah, my son was here. He probably is drinking beer on it. Probably still there. Oh, yes. Well, this is. Very nice job. This is really.
We're going to a football game now.
Oh,
So let's find and see me sometime. I have, and I can share with you. I'll make the pictures look nicer and then we'll do something with it. Instagram, Facebook, whatever. Okay, take care. You did a super job. Fantastic.
You made it happen.
So good. Glad you enjoyed.
Dude, I was super impressed. Really, honestly.
Really came together last minute as always.
Oh, man, it was just the best, honestly. Super impressive, very, very educational. And like you were really, really relaxed and funny and hey, hi.
Hello, Nonna. You are muted.
You have to unmute yourself.
You're wonderful, lady.
Katie, great.
You
loved
it.
We saw everything.
Good.
It started early though.
Oh, really? I thought we started late.
No, I had 12:30 and I turned it on at 20 past and you had just started.
Oh, okay. Well, that was a communication breakdown, but it's good. It worked out.
Great.
Worked out beautifully.
Great.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
He did so well, didn't he? Didn't he
You
do
must be,
Absolutely. Completely relaxed and eloquent.
yes,
and funny and both educational, but also off the cuff, and you were yourself, you know, really impressive.
It was good.
Absolutely. Bravo,
a
bravissimo.
born speaker.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Did you hear the first person who asked the question?
Yes,
That it was, he said it was the best presentation he's seen by a professor or a student.
what is she? It was a lady. That's what she said.
80, the job offers will follow shortly.
Everyone's biased. They all know me. Except for those 3 people that sat there. I have no idea.
Who was the guy that asked like 5 questions?
That's Graham's dad.
Who's Graham? Oh, he's not a,
He's like you, except Jewish.
it's like me, he's
Yeah.
Jewish. Okay.
He lives in Newton.
Oh, does he really? The guy over there? Oh,
The guy who asked this guy.
no, I'm talking about the guy.
Oh, that guy. No, that was Charlie's dad. Yeah, he's a good guy. He actually went with us to the bar last night. Oh, really? Yeah, he's a good guy. He just met him yesterday, and Charlie's also a good guy. He's just like, you'll get to meet everybody
Oh,
later.
He's really enormous.
We aren't we huge?
Hi.
Hi,
Hello there.
Hi.
Congratulations to Aiden and
congratulations.
the whole family,
Yes,
the family that raised him.
Thank, well, you too.
it sounded as if you had a lot of interesting questions. People were very interested. How large audience do you
Did a great job.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I was pleased with the turnout. You saw Paul was here as well. Paul was another big factor. So
Who's Paul? Which one was Paul?
the guy who was like, oh, do you remember any Swahili?
Oh, that guy was giving you a hard time. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, Paul, he like watched the presentation twice for like a trial run. And
Good, so he was
he gave me a lot of suggestions.
Was he on the list of people that helped you? The list at the, on the slide?
Acknowledgements.
No, he was
No.
not. Forgot something.
Oh. Anyway, hi, Nunsies. Uh-oh.
Hi.
How many folks?
All right, well, we're looking forward to seeing you when you drive up later today.
There you go.
We better get going. We'll miss the game. Are you going to the football game?
Yes, we're going now. It's just begun.
Yeah.
Okay, then let's say goodbye and we will shut down. We will leave the Zoom then.
Yes, and the good news is this was all recorded. Hopefully, the microphones. How was the audio for you?
Very good,
Very good,
very good.
excellent, perfect.
Did it see me clearly the whole time?
Yes,
Good.
We
No.
didn't have any visual, probably didn't turn it on.
what do you
But-
mean?
We had the slides.
Oh, okay, so you didn't see me. All right. Yeah.
You, no.
We saw you at the beginning.
Yeah. But I think there'll be another view of me.
Oh, good.
Is this going to be on YouTube?
Maybe we can upload it, yeah. We'll see it. Yeah, you see this view right here. That's the view.
Got it.
Okay,
Okay, ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Have
Oh,
fun.
ciao, enjoy.
Bye now.
enjoy
Bye.
coming.
Bye.
Good job. Okay, great.
Oh, there was no way.
All right, let's stop recording.